began with a vow to liberate Jerusalem and ended with Christian swords cutting down fellow Christians in the streets of the greatest city in the medieval world. The Fourth Crusade was supposed to strike at the heart of the Muslim world. Instead, it tore the heart out of Byzantium. So there's part 1, Shadows of the Third Crusade. In 1187, Saladin's armies swept through the Crusader states.
No! This cannot be!
Retaking Jerusalem after almost a century of Latin rule. The shock reverberated across Europe. Kings and knights once more took the cross, and the greatest warriors of Christendom marched east. Richard the Lionheart, Philip II of France, and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. These were names that filled the people with hope. The Third Crusade did not lack glory. Acre was retaken after a brutal siege, the coast secured by a string of ports, and battles were fought that became legend. Yet Jerusalem remained out of reach. Richard and Saladin made peace in 1192. The Kingdom of Jerusalem would survive, but as nothing more than a fragile sliver of coastal fortresses. Behind these front lines, distrust spread like wildfire. The Latin knights regarded the Byzantines as duplicitous, unwilling to shed blood for the cross. The Byzantines looked west and saw only reckless invaders who cared little for the empire they trampled through. By the end of the Third Crusade, Jerusalem was still in Muslim hands and Christendom was more divided than ever. The stage was set not for salvation, but for catastrophe. Chocolate Quaint. Part 2, A New Call to Arms. In January 1198, a new pope ascended the throne of St. Peter, Innocent III. He was young, brilliant, and utterly determined to lead Christendom to glory. Above all else, one dream consumed him, the recovery of Jerusalem. Through the fiery preaching of Fulk of Neuilly, the crusading spirit spread once more through France and beyond. At a great council held in Soissons in 1200, a decision was made. Egypt would be the first target. The logic was clear. Strike at Cairo, shatter the power of the Ayyubid dynasty, and Jerusalem would fall like a ripe fruit into Christian hands. But there was a problem. The route to Egypt lay across the sea. The crusade needed ships, hundreds of them. Only one power in the Mediterranean could provide such a fleet: Venice. The holy cause, before it had even begun, was bound to the merchants of the lagoon. A crusade meant to serve God would now march under the shadow of Venetian gold. Part 3, The Venetian Deal. The contract was staggering. Venice promised to build, man, and supply a fleet capable of carrying 33,500 crusaders, 4,500 knights, 9,000 squires, 20,000 infantry, with horses, arms, and provisions. The price, 85,000 silver marks. The scale of the task was immense. Venetian shipyards worked day and night for a year. Trade across the Republic was halted as carpenters hammered, sails were cut, and ropes spun. Even the old blind Doge, Enrico Dandolo, took the cross himself, binding his people's fortunes to the cause. But when the Crusaders gathered in the 1202, disaster struck. Barely a third of the expected numbers arrived. Instead of 33,500, there were only about 12,000, and their coffers were empty. They could pay barely half of what they owed Venice. For the Venetians, it was betrayal. For the Crusaders, it was desperation. The mighty fleet lay waiting in the lagoon, but the contract was broken before it had begun. It was here in the waters of Venice that the Holy War began to twist into something else, something far darker. Part 4. The First Diversion. Zara. Dandolo offered the Crusaders a grim bargain. If they could not pay, they could serve Venice in war. The target, Zara, a Christian city on the Dalmatian coast that had rebelled against Venetian rule and placed itself under the protection of Hungary, itself a Crusader kingdom. Many Crusaders recoiled. Was this not blasphemy, to march under the cross against fellow Christians? Pope Innocent forbade it in the strongest terms, yet hunger and debt outweighed conscience. In November 1202, Zara's walls fell after a short siege. Its people were massacred, its churches looted, its banners torn down. The Pope excommunicated the entire crusading host. A holy war to free Jerusalem had begun with the destruction of a Catholic city. The stain could not be washed away. Even among the Crusaders, divisions deepened. Some left in disgust, while others hardened themselves to the path ahead. The crusade was now a pilgrimage in name only. The Shepherds, Part 5, A Prince in Exile. That winter, a new figure entered the stage. Alexios Angelos, son of the deposed Byzantine Emperor Isaac II. Exiled and desperate, he sought out the Crusader leaders with an extraordinary proposal. If the Crusaders restored him to his father's throne in Constantinople, he promised unimaginable rewards: 200,000 silver marks, food for the army for a year, 10,000 Byzantine soldiers to march with them, the Byzantine fleet to carry them to Egypt, and, most astonishing of all, the submission of the Orthodox Church to Rome. For an army starved of coin and food, the offer was irresistible, yet behind it lay peril. The Byzantines despised the Latins and had no desire to see a foreign-backed prince rule them. The Crusaders, however, heard only what they wanted to hear: salvation for their finances and a clear path to Jerusalem. In truth, they were stepping into a web of intrigue from which there would be no escape. Warwarn. Part 6. To the Queen of Cities. On 23 June 1203, the Crusader fleet appeared before Constantinople. The Queen of Cities, with her golden domes, massive walls, and 500,000 souls.
The Crusaders are at the gates. What are your orders, sire? Prepare the defenses. We will not yield.
Never before had a crusading army turned its arms against the greatest city in Christendom. Inside, Emperor Alexios III sat on the throne, but his people despised him for cowardice and corruption. Still, he refused to yield. The Crusaders attacked by land and sea. Venetian galleys smashed through the great chain across the Golden Horn, and armored knights stormed the sea walls. Alexios III fled in the night, and Isaac II was freed from prison. His son, Alexios IV, was crowned co-emperor. For the Crusaders, it seemed the gamble had paid off. But their prize was fragile. Constantinople simmered with hatred. The Byzantines saw Alexios IV not as their ruler, but as a puppet of barbarians. The Crusaders, meanwhile, grew restless, unpaid, and suspicious. The city was theirs in name, but it was a city balanced on a knife's edge. Dinor. Part 7. The Great Fire. Alexios IV now faced the impossible. The Byzantine treasury was empty. To fulfill his promises, he stripped gold from icons, melted chalices, and looted churches. To his subjects, it was sacrilege. To the Crusaders, it was still never enough. Tensions exploded. Riots swept the city. Latin merchants were slaughtered in the streets. Skirmishes broke out between Byzantines and Crusaders. In August 1203, a fire set during fighting raged through Constantinople. Entire districts burned to ash. 100,000 people were left homeless. The Crusaders camped outside the walls, watching the flames consume the city they had come to protect. The Byzantines, in turn, looked on them as enemies, not allies. By now, the dream of Jerusalem was gone. All that remained was bitterness, suspicion, and a city on the verge of ruin. Takerfurn, Part 8. Betrayal and Murder. By January 1204, the situation collapsed. Isaac II died. His son Alexios IV was overthrown, imprisoned, and strangled by a rival general. Alexios V, Mortzouphlos. Strong, cunning, and ruthless, Mortzouphlos seized the throne and vowed to expel the Latins by force. From the walls, the new emperor mocked the Crusaders, refusing their demands for payment. For the Crusaders, starving and betrayed, there was no choice left. They had gambled everything on Constantinople, and now only conquest could save them. The holy vow to Jerusalem was dead. What remained was war for survival, war for loot, war for vengeance. The Crusaders sharpened their swords and built their towers. Constantinople itself was now their Jerusalem. Part 9. The Sack of Constantinople. On the 12th of April, 1204, the wind turned in favor of the Venetians. Their fleets surged against the sea walls, and the Crusaders stormed the battlements. The Byzantine defense crumbled. The Varangian guard fought to the death, but it was not enough. What followed was 3 days of horror. Constantinople, the greatest city in Christendom, was plundered without mercy. Palaces, churches, and monasteries were stripped bare. Hagia Sophia itself was defiled, its altar broken, its mosaics smashed. Priceless relics, icons, and treasures were carried west to Venice and beyond. Statues that had stood since the time of Rome were melted for coin. The slaughter was indiscriminate. Men, women, and children were put to the sword. Nuns were raped on the steps of churches. Drunken soldiers paraded in stolen vestments. The Queen of Cities was reduced to a gutted carcass, her glory trampled in the mud. Priurum. Part 10. The Latin Empire. When the orgy of violence ended, Constantinople was no longer Byzantine. The empire of 1,000 years was carved into pieces. Baldwin of Flanders was crowned emperor of a new Latin empire. Boniface of Montferrat seized Thessalonica. Venice took ports, islands, and treasures beyond counting. But the Byzantines did not disappear. Refugees fled to Nicaea, Epirus, and Trebizond, where they built successor states, vowing to one day reclaim their capital. Yet Constantinople itself lay in ruins. Streets once filled with scholars and merchants were empty. The greatest library in Christendom was gone. Centuries of wealth and culture had vanished in a single week. The Latin Empire would survive barely 60 years, but the wound inflicted on Byzantium was permanent. Even when the city was retaken in 1261, it was a shadow of its former self. Part 11. Legacy of Ruin. The Fourth Crusade deepened the rift between East and West beyond repair. The Orthodox and Catholic worlds would never again be reconciled. Byzantium, crippled by the sack, never regained its former strength. It lingered on, weakened and fractured, until the rising power of the Ottoman Turks finally claimed Constantinople in 1453. What had begun as a holy mission to Jerusalem ended as one of the greatest betrayals in history. The Crusaders had sworn to free the Holy Sepulchre, but instead they defiled Hagia Sophia. They had vowed to strike at the Muslim world, but instead they shattered the greatest Christian city. The Fourth Crusade was not a march of faith. It was the death warrant of Byzantium, and in its flames, the dream of a united Christendom was consumed forever. The road to Jerusalem had been lost the moment the Crusaders sailed into the Golden Horn. The Fourth Crusade was no march of faith. It was the death warrant of Byzantium.
Please subscribe and look for more documentaries at Swords and Shadows.